A famous artist's unfinished painting turned out to be a terrifying prediction. But who was his last model? Detective Alex Nolan had seen his share of peculiar crime scenes in 15 years with the Boston PD's homicide unit, but something about the musty air in Victor Grayson's studio made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The acrid smell of turpentine mingled with aged oils and the metallic undertone of dried paint, creating an atmosphere that felt almost alive, as if the studio itself was holding its breath. Grayson's body slumped in his antique wooden chair, still lifelike enough that for a moment, Alex could almost believe the renowned artist was just lost in thought, contemplating his latest masterpiece. The paintbrush was still clutched in his right hand, dried paint crusted on its bristles. What drew Alex's attention, however, was the massive canvas before the dead man, shrouded in a paint-stained drop cloth that rippled slightly in the draft from the tall windows. Time of death estimated between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. last night, Detective Sarah Chen, his partner, reported from where she stood conferring with the medical examiner. No obvious signs of trauma, but we'll know more after the autopsy. Alex nodded, his attention fixed on that covered canvas. Something about its presence felt wrong, like a shadow that didn't quite match its source. He approached it slowly, aware of the crime scene technicians documenting every detail of the cluttered studio. Paintings lined the walls, landscapes, portraits, and abstract pieces that had made Grayson famous in Boston's art scene. But none of them carried the same weight of anticipation as this hidden work. With latex-gloved hands, Alex carefully grasped the edge of the drop cloth. The fabric felt unusually cold against his fingers, despite the warm September afternoon. He pulled it away in one smooth motion, and the collective gasp from everyone in the room told him he wasn't alone in his shock. The woman in the painting wore a deep crimson dress that seemed to flow like liquid across the canvas. Her pose was elegant, seated in what appeared to be this very studio, with late afternoon light streaming through the windows behind her. But it was her face that made Alex's blood run cold. He'd spent the last 3 days staring at that same face in case photographs, memorizing every detail as he searched for Laura Miller, the missing 28-year-old art gallery curator who had vanished without a trace. "Sarah," he called out, his voice tight. "Come look at this." His partner crossed the room, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. She stopped beside him, and he heard her sharp intake of breath. "That's impossible," she whispered. "That's Laura Miller." Alex pulled out his phone and brought up the case file photo. The resemblance wasn't just close, it was perfect, down to the small scar near her left eyebrow from a childhood accident mentioned in her missing persons report. The way her dark hair fell across her shoulders, the slight asymmetry of her smile, even the distinctive green of her eyes, everything matched exactly. How could Grayson have painted her? Sarah asked, voicing the question thundering through Alex's mind. "We've interviewed everyone in the art community. Nobody had seen her since last Friday night when she left the Hawthorne Gallery's opening." Alex stepped closer to the painting, studying the details. The brushwork was unmistakably Grayson's. He'd seen enough of the artist's work over the past few days of investigation to recognize his distinctive style. The paint was still fresh in places, especially around the woman's face, suggesting recent work. But something else caught his attention. The background of the studio scene seemed to shift slightly as he moved, as if painted from multiple perspectives at once. "Look at this," he murmured, pointing to an area behind the woman's shoulder. "There's something else here, under the surface." Sarah leaned in, squinting. "I see it. Like another figure, but it's been painted over." Alex pulled out his flashlight and shone it across the canvas at an angle. The oblique lighting revealed what they'd missed, ghostly shapes beneath the visible layers of paint, suggesting another person standing behind Laura's chair. The figure was indistinct, deliberately obscured by thick layers of paint, but Alex could make out what appeared to be a hand resting on the chair's back. "Bag his journal," Alex instructed one of the crime scene techs, pointing to a leather-bound notebook on Grayson's cluttered desk. "And I want photos of every angle of this painting, under different lighting conditions." As the tech carefully bagged the journal, Alex's phone buzzed. A text from another detective working Laura's disappearance, security footage from St. James Street. Same clothes as night she vanished. Timestamp 2:43 a.m. last night. Alex showed the message to Sarah. That's less than half a mile from here. Around our estimated time of death, she added, her expression troubled. Alex, what if she wasn't just a subject? What if she was here? Before he could respond, a sharp crack echoed through the studio. Everyone turned toward the sound. One of the tall windows had developed a thin fracture, spreading like a spider's web from a central point. The late afternoon sun catching the cracked glass cast strange, shifting shadows across the painting. Alex approached the window carefully. The crack was on the inside of the glass, and at its center was a small, perfectly round hole, as if something had tried to push its way through from the outside. But they were 4 stories up, and the building's exterior wall was smooth limestone with no ledges or fire escapes on this side. Detective, called one of the crime scene techs, her voice unsteady. You need to see this. She held out Grayson's journal, open to the last entry. The handwriting was shaky, urgent, so different from the precise script on the previous pages. She comes at night. Watches. Tonight she says she'll tell me how to finish it. But the other one doesn't want. The rest of the page was blank, save for a dark smudge that trailed off the edge, as if the pen had fallen from his hand. Get UV lights in here, Alex ordered. I want every inch of this place examined. And somebody find out everything there is to know about Laura Miller's connection to Grayson. Gallery records, emails, phone logs, everything. Sarah was still studying the painting, her flashlight beam playing across its surface. Alex, she said softly, the hand on the chair back, does it look like it's moving to you? He turned back to the canvas, and for a moment, just a moment, he could have sworn the shadowy fingers twitched, curling slightly against the painted wood. But when he blinked, the image was static once more, just layers of oil paint on canvas. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows through the cracked window. As darkness crept into the studio's corners, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something obvious, something right in front of them. And somewhere in the city, Laura Miller was still out there, whether as victim, witness, or something else entirely remained to be seen. Back at the precinct, Alex spread the crime scene photos across his desk. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a stark contrast to the moody atmosphere of Grayson's studio. Sarah sat across from him, scrolling through Laura Miller's digital footprint on her laptop. Here's something, she said, turning the screen toward him. 3 months ago, Laura curated a retrospective of Grayson's early work at the Hawthorne. The reviews were interesting. Alex leaned forward to read. Art critics had called the exhibition haunting and prescient. One reviewer wrote, Grayson's portraits seem to capture not just his subjects' appearances, but moments of their lives that haven't happened yet. Each canvas feels like a window into an inevitable future. That's not all, Sarah continued, clicking through more articles. 2 other models who sat for him in the past year reported strange experiences. One claimed she saw herself in his painting wearing a dress she wouldn't buy until weeks later. Another said the background of her portrait showed a car accident, 3 days before she was actually in one. Coincidences, Alex muttered, but his tone lacked conviction. He picked up one of the crime scene photos, studying the cracked window. The forensics report had come back with no explanation for the break pattern. No impact point, no foreign objects found, just that perfect circular hole radiating spiderweb fractures. His desk phone rang, making him jump. Detective Nolan. Sir, this is Officer Martinez at the front desk. There's someone here you need to talk to. Says she has information about the Grayson case. Name? Catherine Webb. Says she worked as his assistant about a year ago. Alex glanced at Sarah, who was already grabbing her notebook. Send her up. Catherine Webb was a thin woman in her early 30s, with nervous hands that kept adjusting her silver necklace. She perched on the edge of the interview room chair as if ready to bolt at any moment. "I should have come forward sooner," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I didn't think anyone would believe me. It's about the way he painted." "What about it?" Alex prompted gently. "He didn't just paint what he saw. Sometimes he'd start a portrait, and it would change. He'd go into these trances, working for hours without stopping. When he finished, the paintings would show things that hadn't happened yet." She swallowed hard. "The last time I saw him, 2 weeks ago, he was different. Scared. He said something was using his talent, making him paint things he didn't want to see." Sarah leaned forward. "Did he mention Laura Miller?" Catherine's hand flew to her necklace again. "Not by name. But he said she kept visiting the studio at night. He thought he was going crazy at first, seeing things in the shadows. Then the paintings started changing on their own." "Changing how?" Alex asked, keeping his voice neutral despite the chill that ran down his spine. "Details would be different in the morning. Expressions, positions, backgrounds, like someone else was working on them while he slept. That's when he started covering them all. Said he couldn't bear to watch them transform anymore." She paused, looking between the two detectives. "The night I quit, I saw something. In the studio window, a reflection that wasn't mine. A woman in red, but when I turned around." A sudden burst of static from the interview room's fluorescent light made them all jump. When Alex looked back at Catherine, her face had gone pale. "Detective," she whispered, staring at something over his shoulder. "The woman in that painting you found today. Was she wearing my necklace?" Alex's mind raced back to the canvas in Grayson's studio. Around Laura Miller's neck had been a delicate silver chain with a small abstract pendant. He turned back to Catherine, his mouth dry. She was touching her bare throat, her necklace now missing. "I've been wearing this every day for 10 years, she said, her voice shaking. "It disappeared 3 days ago, the night Laura Miller went missing. I've been turning my apartment upside down looking for it." The fluorescent light flickered again, and in the momentary darkness, Alex could have sworn he saw a flash of red reflected in the interview room's window. After Catherine left, Alex and Sarah returned to Grayson's studio. Night had fallen, and the city lights filtered through the cracked window, casting fractured shadows across the canvas. The crime scene tape still sealed the door, but inside, everything remained untouched, a moment frozen in time, just like Grayson's paintings. "The lab results came back on the paint samples," Sarah said, reading from her phone. "The top layers are consistent with Grayson's usual materials, but they found something odd underneath. Traces of pigments they couldn't identify, with properties they've never seen before." Alex approached the painting, studying Laura's face in the beam of his flashlight. The resemblance was still uncanny, but something had changed. Her expression seemed different somehow, more knowing, almost triumphant. He shook his head, blaming it on tricks of the light and his own exhaustion. "I had them run background checks on all of Grayson's recent models," Sarah continued. 5 of them reported strange experiences after sitting for him. One woman said she saw herself walking through her house at night, watching herself sleep. Another claimed her portrait aged 10 years overnight, showing wrinkles and gray hair she didn't have, until 6 months later, when stress turned her hair exactly that shade of gray. "And Laura Miller?" Alex asked, though he already suspected the answer. "She was researching him. Not just for the retrospective, she'd been digging deeper, interviewing former models, collecting stories. Her computer showed searches about historical cases of prophetic art, painters who claimed their works could predict the future." Sarah paused, her flashlight beam joining his on the canvas. The night she disappeared, she'd emailed herself a draft of an article. The title was "The Price of Prophecy, Victor Grayson's Fatal Gift." A sudden draft stirred the dust in the studio, though all the windows were closed. Alex's flashlight beam caught something white fluttering from beneath Grayson's chair, a piece of paper that must have fallen from the journal. He crouched down to retrieve it, finding a sketch done in quick, agitated strokes. It showed the studio, but from an impossible angle, as if the artist had been floating near the ceiling. In the drawing, two figures stood before the canvas. One was clearly Grayson, but the other was just a suggestion of a shape, more shadow than substance, with a hand resting on his shoulder as he painted. The date in the corner was 3 weeks ago. Below it, Grayson had written, "She says I have to finish what I started. Says the portraits are doorways, and she's finding her way through. God help me, I think I finally understand what happened to Richard." "Richard?" Sarah asked, reading over his shoulder. Alex felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. Richard Grayson. Victor's brother. He was a painter too, but he disappeared 40 years ago. His last known work was a self-portrait that reportedly showed him standing in front of an empty canvas. When they found the painting 2 days after he vanished, the canvas in the portrait wasn't empty anymore, it showed him walking away through a door that hadn't been there before. Sarah's flashlight beam wavered. "Alex, look at the painting." He stood slowly, turning toward the canvas. In the crossing beams of their flashlights, something was changing. The shadows behind Laura's figure seemed to be deepening, taking shape. The hand on the chair back was more distinct now, its fingers clearly curled around the wooden frame. And Laura's eyes, they were turned slightly, no longer gazing at the viewer but looking over her shoulder, toward that darker space behind her. A soft scraping sound made them both spin around. On Grayson's desk, his journal lay open, pages ruffling in a non-existent breeze. As they watched, words began to appear on the blank page after his last entry, as if an invisible hand were writing. "The door goes both ways. She found me first, but now I've found her. Time moves differently on canvas. You're looking in the wrong direction, detective." Alex's flashlight beam jerked back to the painting. The background had darkened further, the studio scene behind Laura now almost black. But in that darkness, something was moving. The shadowy figure had taken another step forward, its hand no longer on the chair but reaching toward Laura's shoulder. And Laura's expression had changed again, there was fear in her eyes now, real fear. "Sarah," Alex said, his voice hoarse, "call for backup. Now." But Sarah was already moving toward the door, her phone in hand. As she reached for the handle, the lights in the studio suddenly blazed to life, though neither of them had touched the switch. The sudden brightness was disorienting, and in that moment of confusion, Alex heard Sarah gasp. "The window," she said. "Look at the window." The crack in the glass had changed. What had been a spiderweb pattern of fractures now formed distinct lines, creating what looked like a doorway outlined in broken glass. The circular hole at its center seemed to pulse with a faint red light. Alex's phone rang, making them both jump. It was the lab. Detective Nolan, the technician's voice was excited, almost frantic. "We found something in those paint samples. The unknown pigments. They're not paint at all. Under electron microscopy, they're moving. Actually moving, like they're alive. And the spectrographic analysis shows they're giving off some kind of energy signature we've never seen before." Before Alex could respond, a loud crack echoed through the studio. New fractures were spreading across the window, the glass groaning under impossible pressure. The doorway shape was becoming more defined, its edges sharp and precise. "Get out," Alex told Sarah, already backing toward the door. "Get out now." But as they turned to flee, the studio lights went out again. In the sudden darkness, Alex heard something that made his blood run cold, the soft sound of brushstrokes on canvas. His flashlight beam found the painting just in time to see the final changes taking place. The shadowy figure had stepped fully into view, its features resolving into a familiar face. Victor Grayson himself stood behind Laura's chair, but not as he had looked in death. This was Grayson as a younger man, his eyes burning with an intensity that seemed to stare directly at Alex. And Laura was no longer seated. She was standing now, her red dress rippling as if caught in a wind they couldn't feel. Her hand was raised, reaching toward the edge of the canvas, fingers extended as if pressing against an invisible barrier. Behind her, Grayson's figure had raised his brush, poised to make one final stroke. The journal on the desk fluttered open again, new words appearing. Every artist needs a muse. Every muse needs a door. But who opens it, detective? Who really opens it? A high-pitched tone filled the air, like crystal about to shatter. The cracked window was vibrating now, the red glow at its center intensifying. On the canvas, Laura's fingertips seemed to press against the paint itself, creating ripples in the previously flat surface. Sarah's voice cut through the rising sound, "Alex. The security footage from the night Laura disappeared, we never saw her going into any buildings, did we?" "No," he said slowly, realization dawning. "We only saw her reflection. In windows. In store fronts. Walking parallel to her own image, until she turned the wrong way," Sarah finished. "Until she followed her reflection instead of casting it." A woman's scream shattered the moment, but it wasn't coming from the hallway or the street below. It was coming from the painting itself. Laura's figure was moving more violently now, both hands pressed against the canvas surface, making it bulge outward like a membrane. Behind her, Grayson's figure had begun to paint, his brush moving in swift, desperate strokes that left trails of that strange, living pigment in their wake. "Stop!" Alex shouted, though he knew how absurd it was to address a painting. "Whatever you're doing, stop." The journal's pages flipped wildly, new words appearing and disappearing faster than they could read them. But one phrase repeated, "The door goes both ways. The door goes both ways." Alex's mind raced. The security footage. The reflections. Laura Miller hadn't been abducted, she'd been led. Led to this studio, to this painting, but not by Victor Grayson. By something that had been using Grayson's gift, his ability to paint moments that hadn't happened yet. Something that had been waiting in the spaces between reality and reflection, between present and future, between paint and canvas. "The necklace," he said suddenly. Catherine Webb's necklace. It wasn't just a coincidence that it appeared in the painting. It was proof. Proof of what? Sarah asked, her voice tight with tension. "That Laura isn't just trapped in the painting. She's trying to get out." Alex stepped closer to the canvas, ignoring Sarah's warning grab at his arm. "Look at her face now, really look. She's not the same Laura Miller who disappeared 3 days ago. This is her after something happened, after she learned something. She's not being pulled into the painting. She's pushing her way out." The high-pitched tone from the window had become almost unbearable. The crack-formed doorway was fully defined now, its edges glowing that same deep red as Laura's painted dress. And in its center, where that perfect circular hole had first appeared, Alex could see something moving, like a reflection of a reflection, endlessly repeating. "Victor Grayson didn't kill Laura Miller," Alex continued, the pieces finally falling into place. "He was trying to save her. The portrait, the changes, the living paint, he was creating a way out. But whatever pulled her in, it wasn't going to let her go. Not without taking someone else in her place." The journal's pages settled on a final message: every door needs a key. Every key needs a price. Choose, detective. Choose now. The canvas surface was rippling violently now, Laura's figure pressing against it with increasing desperation. Behind her, the painted Grayson had stopped his brush mid-stroke, his eyes fixed on Alex with an expression of mingled horror and hope. The studio lights flickered in a strobing rhythm that matched the pulse of red light from the window. "Alex," Sarah's voice was barely audible over the rising tone, "your hand." He looked down. Without realizing it, he had reached out toward the painting. His fingers were inches from the canvas surface, and in the strobing light, he could see something impossible. his own reflection in the paint, but wrong somehow. Older. Wearing different clothes. Standing in a familiar studio, but one filled with paintings he hadn't seen yet. The choice crystallized in his mind. Time moved differently on canvas, the journal had said. Doors went both ways. And sometimes, to solve a case, a detective had to be willing to look at evidence from a completely different angle. "Get the paramedics ready," he told Sarah, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. "And whatever happens next, don't let anyone touch that painting until Laura Miller is safe." Before Sarah could respond, Alex pressed his hand against the canvas surface. The paint was cold, impossibly cold, and for a moment nothing happened. Then he felt it, a pull, gentle at first but rapidly strengthening, like a current catching hold. The world tilted sideways. Alex heard Sarah shouting his name, but her voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Colors swirled around him, paint and reality blending together in impossible ways. For a moment that felt like eternity, he existed in a space between spaces, where reflections lived and time moved like oil on water. Then everything snapped back into focus. He was still in Grayson's studio, but not quite. The lights were different, the shadows fell wrong, and every surface seemed to have a slight sheen, as if freshly painted. Laura Miller stood before him, flesh and blood now rather than oil and pigment, her red dress vivid against the strange, shimmering air. "Detective Nolan," she said, her voice echoing oddly. "I knew someone would understand eventually. But we don't have much time. What is this place?" Alex asked, trying to ignore the way his own skin seemed to ripple when he moved, like brush strokes rearranging themselves. "The space between moments," Laura answered, glancing nervously at something over his shoulder. "Where imagination becomes reality, and reality becomes something else. Grayson found it by accident years ago, through his paintings. He thought he was just capturing future moments, but he was actually creating doorways. And something came through," Alex said. "Something that wanted more doorways." Laura nodded. "It used his gift, pushed him to paint more and more. Each portrait became another potential opening. But it needed people on both sides, artists to create the doors, and subjects to open them." A shadow moved behind them, and Alex turned to see the painted version of Grayson still at his easel, his brush suspended in mid-stroke. But now Alex could see what the artist was actually painting, a portrait of himself, Detective Alex Nolan, standing in a sunlit studio that hadn't existed yet. "It's a loop," Alex realized. "Everything that's happened, the portraits, the disappearances, even my investigation, it's all part of some kind of cycle." "Yes," Laura said urgently. "But cycles can be broken. That's what Victor discovered. Wyatt had to silence him. He found a way to change the pattern, to paint an escape instead of another door. But the price." She swallowed hard. "Someone has to stay. To close the door from this side." The shimmering air was beginning to darken around them. In the distance, if distance meant anything in this place, Alex could hear something approaching, a sound like wet canvas being torn, like colors screaming. "Go," he told Laura, understanding now why his reflection had looked older. "Your disappearance is still an open case. Sarah will find you wandering near the gallery, confused but alive. The security cameras will show you walking out of a reflection, but the footage will be too distorted to be conclusive. The case will remain unsolved." "But you'll be trapped here," Laura protested. Alex smiled grimly. "No. I'll be investigating. Someone has to find out how deep this goes, how many other artists have been used this way. How many other doors are out there, waiting to be opened." He looked at the painted Grayson. "And I'll have help." The tearing sound was closer now. The shimmering walls of the studio were beginning to run like watercolors in rain. "Detective," Laura hesitated at the edge of what looked like a frame within a frame, a rectangle of normal reality shining through the painted world. "What should I tell them happened to you?" Tell them. Alex considered as he turned to face the approaching darkness, his hand finding the weight of his badge, which now felt more like a brush than a shield. Tell them I'm looking at the evidence from a new perspective. The darkness engulfed them. Laura stumbled through the frame, back into the solid world, as reality and reflection reshuffled themselves one final time. 3 days later, Sarah Chen stood in the empty studio, staring at the canvas that had started everything. The painting had changed again. Now it showed only a simple scene, Detective Alex Nolan standing at an easel, examining a canvas the viewer couldn't see. The expression on his painted face was one of intense concentration, as if he were unraveling a particularly complex puzzle. The case file lay open on Grayson's desk. Laura Miller had been found, just as Alex had somehow known she would be. The security footage showed exactly what he predicted, a distorted image of her emerging from what appeared to be her own reflection in a gallery window. She remembered everything, but her story was too impossible for any official report. The medical examiner had ruled Victor Grayson's death as heart failure, despite the strange pigments found in his blood. The unknown substances in his paints were classified as inconclusive after 3 different labs failed to reproduce their initial findings of movement and energy signatures. And Alex Nolan was officially listed as missing, last seen investigating a potential lead in the Miller case. Sarah picked up the leather journal, now filled with empty pages except for one final entry in Alex's familiar handwriting: some doors need to stay closed. Others need someone to guard them. The truth is never confined to a single perspective, sometimes you have to step through the frame to see the whole picture. She turned to leave, her footsteps echoing in the empty studio. But just before she reached the door, a flicker of movement caught her eye. In the painting, Alex's figure had turned slightly, and for a moment, brief but unmistakable, Sarah could have sworn he smiled. The case remains officially unsolved. But in certain art galleries, in the quiet hours when light plays tricks with shadows, visitors sometimes report a peculiar sensation. A feeling that the portraits are watching them with unusual intensity, as if looking for something. Or someone. And in one particular studio, now converted to a private gallery, hangs a painting that seems to change subtly each time it's viewed. The nameplate reads simply, "The Detective's New Perspective, Artist Unknown." Some say that if you look at it long enough, you can see other paintings reflected in its surface, works that haven't been created yet, portraits of people who haven't sat for them, moments that haven't quite happened. And in each one, barely noticeable unless you know to look for him, is a figure in the background. A man with a detective's sharp eyes and an artist's careful hands, watching, investigating, protecting the boundaries between paint and reality. But of course, that's just speculation. After all, a painting is just oil on canvas. Isn't it?